I was fired from my job of 10 years for saving an injured dog. I've been driving the same New York City bus route for 5 years, always starting at 6:45 in the morning. It's not glamorous, but it pays most of the bills, and it lets me watch the city wake up. My name's Mike Carter. I'm 35. I live in a cramped place that used to be my parents' home, and I'm the guy who tries to keep his life from falling apart on a daily basis. A lot of folks wouldn't guess it from seeing me behind the wheel, but I've got more worries than the average person has in a month. Sometimes I feel like I'm a breath away from losing it all, so I try to savor every steady moment before the next problem hits. My mother has dementia, which means constant meds, doctor appointments, and unpredictable calls in the middle of the night. My father left years ago to be with someone else, which meant it was on me to move back into my childhood house and step up as her caretaker. I always swore I'd do right by my mom, no matter what life threw at me. I never pictured myself juggling adult diapers and complicated prescriptions. Yet here I am, driving that bus and hoping I don't lose my job, because it's the only thing keeping us afloat. With city traffic and the unpredictability of my schedule, I've already collected 3 official warnings about showing up late. The transit company doesn't like excuses, even if it's something as rough as an elderly parent forgetting she left the stove on or wandering outside in the middle of the night. I still remember that one day I had to sprint down the street, trying to grab my mom before she got to the next block, and then race off to the depot. That incident cost me a mark on my record because I couldn't start the route on time. Another warning came from a tire blowout that ate up half my morning. The third was thanks to a medication mix-up that landed my mother in the emergency room. 3 strikes are enough to keep me on edge every time I see a supervisor wander past. I wish I could wave a magic wand and make extra money appear. New York rent eats up what little I have left after groceries and medical costs. My place is a relic of my childhood, complete with old wallpaper and that sagging front door. But these days, it's the best option I've got. It's definitely not ideal having to explain the rent situation to my landlord, who occasionally suggests I find a better paying job. There's not much out there for me, though. So I keep praying I won't oversleep or get stuck behind a truck that decides to break down right at rush hour. Still, there's a kind of comfort to my early route because I see the same faces most weekdays. I know who hops on near the bodegas, who gets off by the school, and who likes to doze in the back seat until the final stop. Regulars make the job feel a little less lonely. One passenger is an older lady who always carries way too many groceries in her arms. She has that classic grandmotherly vibe, the sort of person who might pinch your cheek if you stand still long enough. Then there's Richard Dawson, a retired accountant who sits near the front, eyes glued to some battered newspaper. He catches my eye with a nod most mornings, a tiny show of recognition that tells me he's in for another ride across the busy streets. I was supposed to keep things running on schedule this morning. The rain was pouring so hard that I had to lean forward to see the road, my wipers frantically swishing water off the windshield. Every stoplight felt like it took a year to turn green. My nerves were on high alert because the boss had said something the other day about my punctuality. I was determined to stay on time, ignore the downpour, and not let anything or anyone slow me down. At first, it all went pretty smoothly. I picked up my regulars, exchanged nods, and tried to settle into a comfortable rhythm. The back of my mind was buzzing with anxiety because I'd spent half the night convincing my mom that there wasn't a stranger knocking at the door. She'd been hearing things again. This meant I'd barely slept, which always makes me jumpy. Yet I forced myself to focus on the traffic lights, the corners, the waiting riders, that whole dance I know too well. Then I reached Greenwood Avenue. It's not the fanciest section of town, but there's a park nearby and a few run-down buildings that used to be nice. Through the blur of rain, something on the sidewalk made me slow down. I thought maybe it was a pile of trash, but then I saw it move. By the time I realized it was a dog, my heart was already pounding. I'm not a big softy, but I can't just leave a living creature in that state. The poor dog was lying there, soaking wet, obviously hurt. I faced a huge dilemma. Part of me wanted to keep driving, because if I lost any more time, that might be it for my job. Plus, the next bus wouldn't show up for another 30 minutes, which would really inconvenience these folks trying to get to work or wherever they needed to be. But then I pictured that poor dog, possibly freezing or dying on the side of the street. Something inside me snapped, and I realized I couldn't just ignore it. My mind was screaming at me about the warnings on my record, about how close I was to losing everything. Yet my gut told me to pull over. I hit the brakes. A chorus of annoyed murmurs rolled through the bus. The rain pelted the windows, and I felt a knot in my stomach, but I opened the door and jogged out. Within seconds, my clothes were completely drenched, but all I could think about was a dog trembling on the pavement. I crouched down and carefully scooped the poor thing into my arms. It looked like a medium-sized mutt, maybe brownish under all that wet fur, with a nasty gash on its side. I quickly wrapped in my jacket, hoping my body heat might help. Getting back on the bus, I could feel the tension in the air. A few riders stared at me like I was crazy. Some seemed worried. Others looked irritated. One older passenger shook her head, probably thinking about how late this would make her. I tried not to make eye contact. I just wanted to focus on making sure that dog stayed alive. I wasn't sure where I could even take it. My brain kept asking if there was a vet nearby who would help. Then another part of me remembered that I still had the rest of my shift ahead. A tiny wave of relief came from the fact that some people appeared genuinely concerned. There was a small child at the front, looking at the dog with tearful eyes, clearly upset by the sight of an injured animal. That child turned toward me, full of that innocent curiosity only kids have, and expressed a soft worry about whether the dog would pull through. I had no easy answer. My thoughts were racing, and I realized I just changed my entire day, maybe my entire life, by letting my instincts take over. In that moment, the only sound was the steady drumming of rain on the roof, the hum of the idling engine, and the faint whimper of the wounded dog. I glanced down at it, wondering if I'd made the right call, knowing there'd be consequences either way. The next question in my head was whether I could keep my job after this. There was no simple choice here, but I was already in too deep to turn back. Meanwhile, that child's unspoken question about the dog's fate hovered in the air, and I had absolutely no idea what would happen next. I stood there in the aisle of my bus, clothes still damp from the rain, trying to shrug off a mix of second thoughts and sheer panic. The injured dog was curled up on one of the seats, shivering under my jacket. Its weak movements made my heart twist with guilt over what might happen next. My day was only halfway through. Yet I already felt like I'd spun off the regular path of my life, veering dangerously close to losing my job and the fragile balance that kept me and my mother afloat. My passengers were a mix of bewildered, impatient, and sympathetic. A few eyed the dog like they were rooting for it, while others glared at their watches as though I'd just taken a detour to another state. Meanwhile, my brain kept replaying the same thought. I needed to do something for this animal, but the rules were clear. No unscheduled stops, no personal errands, and definitely no pushing the timetable beyond its limits. I could almost hear my boss lecturing me in my head. Yet there I was, soaking wet from a rescue mission, my route behind schedule, and my responsibilities hanging by a thread. I knew I had to wrap up the final leg of my route before even thinking about dropping this poor creature at a vet's office. Holding everyone hostage on a busy morning in New York wasn't something I relished, but neither was watching a helpless dog suffer. It was impossible to concentrate on the usual pattern of stops and starts. I'd pull up to a corner, glance at the clock, and realize I'd lost another precious minute. The knowledge that I was already on thin ice with the transit authority gave me that unpleasant sensation of having a stone in my gut. When I finally reached the end of my route, I glanced at the schedule. There was a measly 5-minute break before I had to start the loop again, which normally gave me just enough time to stretch my legs and maybe snag a quick coffee. Today, it felt like an infuriatingly small window for the kind of problem I faced. The sensible move would have been to stay on schedule, but there was no way I could ignore the whimpering dog in my front seat. I'd spent years trying not to let my moral compass derail my already shaky finances, but that morning I just couldn't leave the animal's fate to luck. My mind zeroed in on a memory of a veterinary clinic over on Kingston Street. It wasn't part of my official route, and I knew the detour alone would take longer than my entire break. But my conscience wouldn't let me drive off and pretend I hadn't seen this animal bleeding by the curb. So I made a quick plan to hustle over to Kingston Street, hoping it would only add 15 minutes to my day if I was lucky. Rain pounded the windshield, though it was tapering off slightly, leaving giant puddles in every gutter. I managed to coax the bus through the traffic with careful turns, all too aware of curious stares from the riders who remain on board. It's not every day you see a city bus driver heading off-route for a personal errand, and a few folks muttered under their breath about the inconvenience. Still, I pressed forward, figuring that if I could get the dog in capable hands, maybe I could salvage the rest of the day. Kingston Street had its usual congestion, along with a few random delivery trucks that seemed determined to block my path. I kept checking the time, feeling more anxious with each passing second. Finally, I spotted the faded sign for the veterinary clinic, which was crammed between a rundown bookstore and a souvenir shop selling novelty T-shirts. I parked as neatly as I could, ushered out anyone who needed to go about their business, and scooped the trembling dog into my arms. The clinic's waiting room smelled like antiseptic and featured a battered set of chairs lined up against the walls. A drooping plant in the corner gave the space an oddly homey touch, though it had clearly been neglected. A receptionist seemed momentarily shocked to see a city bus driver hauling in an injured dog, but quickly waved me over. My mind whirled with the weight of everything. My job, my mother, the possibility of facing a supervisor's wrath, and the hope that I was doing the right thing. A vet named Emily Harris stepped forward with a focused expression. She quickly examined the dog's wound, tapping her foot as if bracing for a sprint to the back room. I tried to explain the situation in a scattershot way, careful not to ramble about my job woes or the scolding I might be walking into later. All that mattered was getting proper care for this animal. In a matter of minutes, she checked for a microchip and found one, which meant there was an owner out there who presumably cared about this dog. A small wave of relief washed over me, though I wondered what that meant for the rest of my day. She said she'd contact the owner, and her staff could take it from here. In that moment, I felt a flood of conflicting emotions. Relief that the dog wasn't my sole responsibility anymore, guilt that I was basically dumping the animal and rushing off, and dread about how late I'd already become. My phone buzzed a few times, but I couldn't deal with it until I was back on the bus. When I finally settled into the driver's seat, I saw half a dozen missed calls from the dispatch office. That was the last thing I wanted. My mind immediately pictured the strict supervisors who never budged on their policies. They probably noticed a big gap in my route times. It wouldn't take a detective to figure out I'd gone off the usual roads. By the time I resumed the route and tried to catch up, I was hopelessly behind schedule, weaving through traffic like I could bend time if I just hit the gas pedal harder. Every moment made my heart race, imagining a pink slip with my name on it by the end of the week. The official tardiness ended up being about 25 minutes, enough to register in the system as a serious infraction. My phone kept lighting up, making me feel like I had a ticking clock strapped to my chest. After my final stop, I parked the bus in the depot and finally took a breath. In that moment, I felt like I'd lived 3 lifetimes since dawn. I checked my phone again and found a text message from Paul Henderson. He was part of upper management, the kind of guy who made no exceptions. The message instructed me to swing by his office once I'd wrapped up the day. No explanation, but I didn't need one. I was sure he wanted to talk about my route performance, and it wouldn't be a casual chat. It felt like the walls were closing in on me faster than I could formulate any excuse that might save my job. Leaning back in my seat, I stared at the drizzle on the windshield, thinking about my mother and her never-ending medical bills, remembering the feeling of that dog trembling in my arms, and wishing I could rewind the morning to see if there had been any middle ground. Maybe I could have called animal control or done something less risky. But the truth was that the dog could have died out there. I kept reminding myself that sometimes you have to take a risk, even if it costs you. And this time, I might be paying a hefty price. I gathered my belongings, rubbed my eyes, and braced myself for whatever tongue-lashing was about to happen. Thunder rumbled softly in the distance, hinting that the storm hadn't fully passed. It felt fitting, like nature itself was giving me a heads-up that more turbulence was headed my way. My nerves were frayed, and all I could do was prepare for the worst while hoping for a slim chance that some shred of empathy might spare me from being fired. My phone buzzed again as I stepped off the bus. The same message from Henderson glared back at me, reminding me that a single decision could unravel everything I'd worked so hard to keep together. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, realizing the only path left was to face the music. Maybe I could tell him about the dog, about how leaving it there felt impossible. Maybe he'd see some sliver of understanding. Then again, Paul Henderson was legendary for handing out pink slips faster than a short-order cook flips pancakes. The real question was whether the dog's life was worth it. Deep down, I knew I'd make the same choice all over again, right or wrong. That single act of compassion defined who I was, and I couldn't trade that for a clean record or a stress-free afternoon. Still, I had to acknowledge that this wasn't just about me. My mother, who barely recognized our home some days, counted on me for care and financial support. My father was long gone, having chosen a different path when things got tough. I'd become the reluctant pillar, holding up the last of our small family. If I lost my job, we'd be in dire straits. I tried to force myself to breathe slowly, reminding my racing heart that I hadn't been fired yet, at least not officially. Even so, the tension weighed on me like a physical burden. I walked toward the office building where Henderson and his team kept their watchful eye on every driver's performance. My uniform felt soggy, my head ached, and all I wanted was a quiet moment to process the day. Instead, I was marching toward an inevitable confrontation that could upend my entire life. The fluorescent lights in the hallway felt uncomfortably bright as I approached the place where I'd soon learn my fate. One final glance at my phone showed no new messages apart from the dreaded summons to Henderson's office. This was it. I steeled myself, trying not to imagine the worst-case scenario of handing over my badge and losing the only reliable source of income one had. I knew I'd done something decent by saving that dog, but decency doesn't always align with corporate rules and regulations. Sometimes it's the short-sighted reality of business that hits you in the face when you're just trying to be human. With one last shaky exhale, I prepared to open the office door and step inside. My gut churned at the thought of explaining why my bus route timeline looked like a mess of red flags, or why I had taken time I didn't technically have to whisk a wounded animal to safety. It all came down to a message on my phone. A brief note from Paul Henderson commanded me to appear in his office. I had no idea whether I'd leave that builder with a job or a story about how I lost it on a rainy morning in New York, but there was no turning back. This was my new reality. The dog might be safe, but my future was hanging by the thinnest thread imaginable. I pushed open the office door with a sense of dread that felt heavier than anything I'd carried in years. The fluorescent lights revealed a plain room with a battered desk, a couple of stiff chairs, and walls decorated by motivational posters that looked older than me. Paul Henderson was already seated, peering at a file that probably contained every tardy slip and warning I'd accumulated. My pulse hammered in my ears as I realized how close I was to losing the one thing keeping my entire life from collapsing: my job. A small part of me had hoped for a hint of understanding or some show of empathy. I imagined explaining how I'd made a tough call in the moment, how I couldn't just drive past a wounded creature in the pouring rain. But the look on Henderson's face said it all. He didn't see me as a decent person who made a hard choice. He saw me as a liability. His posture reminded me of those teachers I had back in high school who always believed the worst about me even when I tried my best to toe the line. He reminded me that the company had rules for a reason, that timetables were the backbone of the entire operation, and that I'd already managed to rack up 3 warnings on my record. He didn't speak in a dramatic or angry voice. It was more like a calm, dispassionate tone that made it clear this wasn't a debate. This was a done deal. I felt my stomach sink further with every word he directed at me about the importance of punctuality, the negative impact my actions had on riders, and the risk of damaging the company's reputation. I tried to hold myself together long enough to speak up in my own defense. My voice felt shaky as I attempted to convey the urgency of the situation I'd faced that morning. I explained how the dog was badly hurt, how I realized that leaving it behind in the rain would have been downright cruel. A flicker of desperation pushed me to mention that I'd been a dependable driver for nearly a decade, even with the occasional lateness. In a different context, maybe someone would have given me a pat on the back for showing kindness in a city where folks often walk right by someone in need. But Henderson's expression didn't waver. He cut in with a statement about how the company needed drivers who didn't break schedule. He said the organization simply couldn't afford to bend the rules for anyone, and that my record spoke for itself. I wanted to protest that my track record wasn't so terrible, that I just had a few rough mornings thanks to my mom's declining health and the random disasters that life threw at me. However, I could see my words bouncing off a solid wall of indifference. It was like trying to persuade a machine that was already programmed to say no. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a piece of paper that looked eerily official. My stomach knotted when I realized it was my notice of termination. 10 years of putting up with rude passengers, unpredictable traffic, and early morning alarms. Gone in an instant. I wanted to argue, but my throat felt tight. Part of me feared I might lose my composure entirely, and the last thing I wanted was to let Henderson see me break down. It wasn't until I spotted the security guard standing near the door that the enormity of the situation fully sank in. That guard was there to escort me out, as if I posed a threat. For a moment, my mind raced with the memory of how I'd always tried to be a decent co-worker, lending a hand to newer drivers or giving a nod of respect to management. To have my efforts reduced to a liability form and an escorted walk to the exit felt like a personal betrayal. But I also knew there was nothing left to say. Henderson had made up his mind long before I set foot in that office. I signed the paper, my hands trembling slightly as I read the official language stating that I was no longer employed by the transit authority. The reason was neatly typed. Repeated violations of company punctuality standards, culminating in unscheduled detour. It was surreal to see something so important reduced to a single sentence. 10 years of labor, thousands of miles behind the wheel, and that was all it took to wipe it out. The guard gestured for me to follow him, and I found myself walking to the halls I'd known for a decade. Posters on the walls advertised new safety measures and upcoming employee events, none of which I'd be attending now. I felt the burning stares of a few co-workers who'd likely heard the rumors. Some offered awkward glances of sympathy, while others looked away as if to avoid catching whatever bad luck had just befallen me. Stepping outside, I was hit by a gust of cold wind, the sky still gray from the morning storm. I couldn't even muster the energy to reflect on what had happened. My thoughts drifted to my mother, whose medication bills wouldn't stop arriving just because I no longer had a paycheck. The image of the badly hurt dog flashed through my mind, reminding me of why I was in this mess. Did I still believe I'd made the right choice? It felt like a question that might haunt me for a while. With nowhere else to go, I ended up at a nearby bus stop. It was the first time in a decade that I'd stood on the passenger side of things, waiting for a vehicle I used to drive. My reflection in the scratched metal schedule box didn't do me any favors. I looked exactly how I felt. Exhausted, drenched in hopelessness, and worn down by the weight of responsibility. Another bus eventually rumbled up, and I stepped inside, swiping a fare card that still had a few rides loaded on it. The seats felt strangely foreign, even though I'd been around buses for years. Something about being on the opposite side of the driver's seat gave me a sense of displacement, like the world had flipped upside down. I found a spot by the window and watched the familiar city pass by, the sidewalk slick with leftover rain. My mind churned with questions about what came next. My savings were minimal, my mom's caretaker needs were growing, and rent day hovered around the corner. I'd never felt so close to the edge. One part of me bristled in anger that showing compassion to a badly hurt animal could cost me everything. Another part clung to the belief that leaving the dog would have haunted me forever, so maybe I'd made the only decision that let me sleep at night. Most of the passengers around me seemed wrapped up in their own worries, scrolling through phones or gazing out the windows like they were chasing their own daydreams. For all they knew, I was just another tired commuter heading home from a rough day. I guess that's what I was now, just another face in the crowd, stripped of the uniform that used to define my livelihood. Everything I'd done, every small act of kindness toward my regular riders, every conversation shared in the early hours of the morning was replaced by a sense of emptiness. I stared at the bus's floor, noticing every speck of dirt, every scuff, as if searching for some sign of hope or redemption. My chest felt hollow when I realized that for the first time in a long while, I had no workplace to go back to. The routine I'd clung to was gone, replaced by a new reality of unemployment. It was like an unexpected free fall, and I couldn't see the bottom. The bus jerked to a stop near my neighborhood, and I hesitated before stepping off. A drizzle had started again, a light rain that tapped gently on the rooftops. Each drop seemed to echo my internal state, a quiet gloom that threatened to drown me in negative thoughts. I tried to imagine ways to find a new job, maybe something that didn't involve such strict timetables or a high-risk environment. But in New York, competition was brutal, and I had no illusions about the difficulty of getting hired somewhere at 35, especially when the back of my mind screamed about my mother's needs. Eventually, I got off at the stop closest to home and made my way down the sidewalk, barely noticing the drizzle that clung to my jacket. The weight of unemployment pressed down on me with every step, and my thoughts circled around how I would break the news to my mom. After turning the final corner, I reached the front of my apartment building. My hand hovered on the door handle, heart pounding as if I were about to face an army rather than an empty hallway. I stared at the chipped paint and felt a rush of shame swirl with fear, bracing myself for a future that suddenly looked darker than the storm clouds overhead. I couldn't bring myself to open the door just yet, because once I stepped inside, there would be no hiding from what had happened. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the rain fall, wondering whether I'd find the strength to tell my mother about losing the job I'd held for 10 long years. I lingered a moment longer outside my apartment door, wishing I could vanish in the thin air rather than face whatever waited on the other side. The chipped paint on the handle reminded me that my entire life felt just as worn. Still, there was no avoiding reality forever. I turned the knob and slipped inside, bracing myself for what came next. The place was cramped, just a tiny Brooklyn setup with a narrow hallway, peeling linoleum in the kitchen, and windows that rattled whenever someone slammed a door in the stairwell. It wasn't much, but it was home. And right then, I felt an odd mix of comfort and dread. The caretaker, Lisa, was seated on the small sofa, scrolling through something on her phone. She glanced up the instant I stepped in and must have read my expression like a headline. Her face said it all. She knew something bad had gone down. My mother was asleep in the bedroom, her gentle snores barely audible through the thin walls. That was probably for the best. Mom's health had taken a downer over the past year, and dealing with me in a frantic state wouldn't do her any favors. Part of me was relieved she was resting, but another part dreaded the conversation we'd eventually have. Lisa rose quietly and asked if everything was okay, though I could tell she already suspected the answer. I felt my throat tighten as I tried to find words that wouldn't sound too desperate or pitiful. I managed to explain in a subdued voice that I'd lost my job over the dog I'd rescued. The moment the words left my mouth, it felt like a weight had been lifted, only to be replaced by the hollow awareness of what was now at stake. Lisa's face softened with concern, and she murmured something about me having a good heart. She wasn't scolding me or judging my choice. In fact, she seemed impressed that I'd risked my position for a wounded animal, calling it an act of kindness that was all too rare. Despite my panic, her reaction gave me a tiny measure of comfort, yet her compassion couldn't erase the bigger problem I now faced. Lisa had more news. Apparently the agency she worked for demanded payment by Friday for continued care. Otherwise, they'd pull her from the schedule, and my mother would be left without professional assistance. It wasn't that Lisa wanted to bail, but she was bound by the agency's policies. She quietly confessed that she'd already covered for me once or twice, stretching the timeline for payment as much as she could. But there was no more wiggle room now. My heart sank further when I realized a new timeline. It was already Wednesday, and I had a total of 0 paychecks coming in. My last direct deposit had barely covered the basics, and I only had enough savings for about 2 more months of rent if I cut back on everything else. Another wave of guilt washed over me as I thought about my mother's medication costs. The caretaker's visits were part of what kept her safe, so losing them was an option. I wished I could conjure a pile of money out of thin air. Instead, I was staring down a bleak future where my mother's well-being was on the line. Lisa, to her credit, tried to reassure me that things might work out. She talked about part-time gigs, possible programs, maybe even a fundraiser. I appreciated her optimism, but I struggled to imagine how any of that would come together in time. My mind felt like it was spinning in 100 directions, each one ending in a dead end. I wanted to step outside, get some fresh air, and pretend this wasn't my life. But running away wouldn't fix anything. I forced myself to sit down because my legs were trembling under the weight of everything I had just learned. The chipped coffee table in front of me held a stack of medical bills I hadn't mustered the courage to open. It was a depressing sight, a testament to how fragile my safety net really was. And now that net had vanished entirely. Lisa was rummaging in her bag, maybe searching for a business card or a pamphlet about assistance programs. I felt a surge of gratitude for her trying to help, but it barely cut through my panic. All of a sudden, my phone buzzed against the table, the sound making both of us jump. I nearly let it go to voicemail, figuring it was a bill collector or, worse, some spam call, but I picked it up out of sheer reflex. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, which made me hesitate again. Still, an odd instinct told me to answer, as though something important might be on the other end. My voice came out shaky when I greeted the caller. A woman asked if she was speaking with Michael Carter. The mention of my full name immediately put me on alert. I hesitantly confirmed it, and she introduced herself as Dr. Emily Harris. My heart did a small flip. That was the veterinarian who treated the dog I brought in. For a split second, I worried she was about to tell me something terrible, like the dog hadn't made it or had complications. But her tone sounded measured, almost professional yet with a hint of encouragement. She explained that the dog's owner had come forward after being contacted by the clinic. Apparently, there was some kind of twist. The owner wanted to meet me in person, to talk about everything that had happened. I felt a spark of confusion, wondering if I was being set up for some sort of lawsuit, or if they just wanted to say thanks. I thought back to my chaotic morning, the dog's terrified eyes in the rain, and how that split-second choice to help change my entire life. I started to feel a knot of apprehension in my gut. Lisa watched my expression closely. I could tell she was trying to piece together who was on the other end of the line. When I hung up, I relayed the gist of the conversation. Dr. Harris said the owner wanted to speak with me personally. No details, just a request for a meeting. Lisa's eyebrows went up at the mention of the veterinarian, and a small, hopeful smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She gently suggested that maybe this was a chance, that life sometimes opens a door when another one slams shut. It sounded cliché, but I was in such a desperate place that I found myself clinging to any crumb of optimism. I glanced at the clock. It was late, but not too late to consider heading out. My mother was still asleep, and Lisa would stay for a while yet. The agency demanded money by Friday, but if there was even the tiniest possibility that meeting this dog owner could provide me with a lead or a lifeline, I owed it to myself to follow that thread. I wasn't used to relying on chance or strangers, but normal rules had gone out the window the minute my supervisor handed me a pink slip for being compassionate. Yet fear gnawed at me. What if the owner was furious about the dog's injuries? Maybe they blamed me or planned to sue. If that happened, I'd be in even more trouble. On the other hand, if they simply wanted to thank me and that was the end of it, at least I'd have closure. Right now, a little closure seemed better than dwelling on how quickly my life had unraveled. Lisa urged me to go, reading the tension on my face and guessing what was rolling around in my head. She assured me she'd keep watch over my mom, and that maybe the best thing I could do was see this through. I paced around the living room, each step squeaking on the old floorboards. My mind flicked back to that morning. The heavy rain, my heart pounding as I picked up the trembling dog, the furious looks from some passengers, and the gnawing guilt of messing up the schedule. I recalled the moment Dr. Harris scanned the dog for a microchip, discovering it wasn't just a stray. I tried to remember if I heard anything about the dog's breed or name, but everything was a blur. The only certainty was that the dog's life was as uncertain as mine in that moment, each of us depending on the kindness of the right person at the right time. And now I was the one in need of kindness, or, at the very least, a stroke of luck. Maybe the dog's owner was wealthy and charitable, or maybe they were just an average person who wanted to meet the bus driver who detoured on a whim. I had no idea what to expect. But I did know that sitting in my apartment obsessing over how to pay for my mother's care wouldn't make the phone stop ringing with bills. Lisa's gentle words echoed in my mind. This could be an opportunity. I tried to hold on to that thought, as shaky as it felt. Outside, the day had dimmed into evening, the sky a dusky purple spatter with hazy clouds. I looked at the clock again and figured I still had time to head to the clinic if I wanted to catch Dr. Harris or get more information. The phone call had been short, leaving me with more questions and answers. Part of me wanted to hide under a blanket and ignore the world, but that urge wouldn't fix anything, and I needed to do something before Friday. My mother deserved the best care, and I couldn't stomach the idea of losing her caretaker because my paycheck had vanished. Before I could second-guess myself, I rummaged in a small drawer for my keys, told Lisa I'd be back soon, and tried to muster a confident nod. She gave me a gentle pat on the shoulder, reminding me to keep my head up. Even in my desperation, I caught a glimpse of admiration in her eyes, like she believed I had enough courage to see this through. It was a small boost, but when you're down to your last shred of hope, even a small boost can feel monumental. As I slipped out the door, I paused in the hallway for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. The enormity of the situation kept washing over me in waves. One day I was a bus driver, struggling but managing, and now I was unemployed, staring down a massive financial deadline, and chasing a phone call from a stranger who might hold my lifeline. Life sure had a sense of humor. I shut the door softly so as not to wake my mom, then made my way down the creaky stairs, each step echoing like a reminder of the uncertain road ahead. I still wasn't sure if meeting the dog's owner would do anything for me, but it was the only real lead I had. Time felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and every passing hour brought me closer to a new level of crisis. Yet there was a subtle current of determination growing inside me, fueled by the memory of the morning's rescue and Lisa's quiet encouragement. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was just an unexpected detour in a life that desperately needed a change. Heading out into Brooklyn streets, I noticed the puddles from earlier rain had mostly vanished. The air felt cold, but less harsh than it had. My breath came out in a steady rhythm, and the lights from passing cars reflected off the slick pavement. I pulled my jacket tighter and stared ahead, unsure what I might find, but unwilling to let fear keep me stuck in place. One foot in front of the other. Somehow that was the best strategy one could manage. I glanced at my phone again, rechecking the number from Dr. Harris, half expecting to see a new message pop up with more details. Nothing came, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the brink of something. I just had to muster the courage to see it through, even if it meant putting my pride on the line in front of a stranger who, for reasons unknown, wanted to speak with me directly. At that point, what did I really have to lose? Sometimes, life corners you so completely that the only move left is to embrace the unpredictable. That was my reality now, cornered by unemployment, fear for my mother's health, and an unsteady hope pinned on a dog and its mysterious owner. The caretaker's words echoed in my head. Maybe it was a chance, a small opening in an otherwise overwhelming wall of problems. I took a final deep breath and kept walking, determined to find out whether that opening might lead to something better than the dead end I currently faced. I made my way through the darkened streets, trying not to let my nerves get the better of me. Brooklyn can feel like a different planet at night, especially when your future is resting on a single conversation. A part of me still worried that the dog's owner might be looking for someone to blame, or, worse yet, might not show up at all. My head was a constant swirl of doubts, but I kept going because I didn't have any other leads. Lisa's quiet encouragement echoed in my mind, and I tried to hold on to that as I walked. When I arrived at the clinic, the place was mostly quiet. A lone receptionist at the front desk waved me in, barely looking up from her phone. The lights cast a sterile glow over the waiting area, which was empty except for a few plastic chairs and the faint hum of an air conditioner. My heart thumped as I wondered if I'd come too late. But then I noticed a well-dressed man in the corner. He glanced up, saw me, and stood. He looked to be around 50, with confident posture and a suit that probably cost more than I earned in a few months. He introduced himself as George Thompson, explaining that he was the owner of the dog I had rescued. My anxiety spiked for a moment, because he didn't smile right away or show any obvious gratitude. But then, he thanked me for what I had done. He seemed a bit formal at first, like he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between us. I offered a stiff nod, suddenly wishing I'd had the foresight to dress better than the wrinkled clothes I'd thrown on in my rush out the door. Still, I tried to stay composed. I told him the dog was lying by the curb in the rain, and leaving it there had seemed unthinkable. He listened intently, then told me that the dog's name was Max, and that it had originally belonged to his late mother. Apparently, Max was the last living reminder of a person George cared about most. I felt a pang of empathy for him. The dog was more than just a pet. It represented a final piece of family he'd lost. Despite George's impressive presence and fancy suit, the emotion in his voice gave me a glimpse of a more vulnerable person underneath. He asked me why I would risk my job and my schedule for a hurt animal. I tried to shrug off the question like it was no big deal, but I couldn't hide the truth. My answer was basically that it felt like the right thing to do. I couldn't drive by and do nothing. There wasn't a long, complicated reason. I just knew I wouldn't have slept well that night if I'd left Max to suffer in the street. George went quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh my words. Then, with a thoughtful nod, he said genuine acts of kindness were rare in his world. He'd met plenty of people who claimed to be charitable, but few who actually put something on the line to help someone, or something, in need. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a piece of paper, and held out toward me. My gut twisted in confusion, but I took it, curiosity winning out. A rush of disbelief hit me when I realized it was a check made out to me for $15,000. The sum made my heart slam against my ribs, far more than I'd ever seen in one place. After the day I'd had, being fired, facing overdue bills, worrying about the caretaker's ultimatum, this moment felt surreal, like it had been plucked from a daydream. I managed a few stammered words of gratitude, but they didn't come out right. George simply said it was the least he could do, since I'd saved something precious to him. Somewhere in the conversation, George mentioned he ran several different companies, one of which specialized in upscale transportation services. I might not have been the sharpest at business details, but even I could connect the dots. If he owned multiple companies, he had to be doing extremely well. He spoke matter-of-factly, though, as if it were just a detail rather than a boast. He asked about my current situation, and I had to admit I'd lost my job over rescuing Max. He looked genuinely troubled that doing the right thing had cost me everything. Then he said something that nearly made me drop the check. He needed a regional manager for his company, someone who understood the value of empathy, real-world experience, and reliability. Would I be interested? For a second, I thought he had to be joking. But he explained how he was expanding his luxury transportation services in the city and needed someone he could trust to handle day-to-day operations. He mentioned a salary 3 times what I'd been making, plus full benefits. My vision blurred with gratitude and disbelief. I'd gone from hopeless to hopeful in a single conversation. I tried to ask why he was doing all this for a stranger with nothing to offer in return but a moment of compassion. George just gave a small smile, saying he believed that honest individuals deserve more than a simple nod of thanks. He'd grown jaded seeing success rewarded for selfish acts, while genuine kindness often went unnoticed. My actions showed him I was willing to put compassion above convenience. My head spun with a roller coaster of emotions. Just hours earlier, I was panicking, jobless, and on the brink of financial disaster. Now, this man with multiple firms and a big heart was essentially offering me a lifeline. It felt almost too good to be true, yet part of me wanted to trust it. Sometimes real life surprises you when you least expect it. George told me to take some time to decide, but not too long, since things were moving fast on his end. I couldn't stop staring at the check for $15,000 in my hands. Outside the clinic window, the city lights shimmered in the distance, and I thought about how quickly everything can shift. One rainy day, one injured dog, one choice, and suddenly my entire life might look different. When I finally left the clinic, I felt like my feet were barely touching the ground. The night air in Brooklyn was cold, but it felt less harsh than before. My thoughts whirled with possibilities. Paying the caretaker, covering the rent, making sure my mother got her medications. If I accepted George's offer, maybe we'd finally have some stability. The idea felt so foreign that I wasn't sure whether to laugh, cry, or both. By the time I made it home, Lisa was still in the living room, anxiously waiting to hear what happened. I struggled to form the right sentences. But once I showed her the check and explained the job offer, her eyes lit up like Times Square. I told her it felt like a dream, something that only happened to other people. She just smiled and said maybe it was about time I got the break I deserved. I felt a swell of gratitude toward Lisa for always seeing the good in me. My mother was awake, sitting on the edge of her bed. She looked confused at first, but gave me a small smile. I settled beside her, keeping my voice quiet. I said we'd have enough money to keep Lisa around and pay for the bills. I didn't go into every detail, but the relief on her face told me she understood that life had just taken a turn for the better. She pressed her hand over mine, whispering something about good things happening to people who try to do the right thing. That night, I hardly slept, but for once it was excitement that kept me awake rather than worry. My mind reeled at the thought of a new job, paying triple what I earned as a bus driver, with insurance that took care of my mother's needs, all from stopping for a badly hurt dog on a wet sidewalk. It felt like the universe was telling me that doing the right thing might cost you short term, but it can lead to unexpected rewards. In the following days, I met with George again and hashed out the contract. He introduced me to a few of his key team members, and I started to realize just how extensive his operations were. More importantly, though, he treated me like an equal, someone whose values and insight mattered. Even my mother seemed more relaxed once she learned we had a plan for our future, and Lisa stuck around, quietly proud of how everything was turning out. A couple weeks later, as I got settled into my new role, I sometimes had to pinch myself to believe it was real. Only a short while ago, I was driving a bus and fretting about every minor delay. Now I was overseeing a part of George's transport business, managing schedules, staff, and routes for clientele willing to pay top dollar for luxury service. All because I stopped on a rainy day to help a stranger's dog. One evening, after a particularly busy day of training, I sat beside my mother's bed. The scent of her lavender lotion filled the air, and she gazed up at me with a warm, though slightly distant, look in her eyes. I assured her everything was going to be okay now, that we had the resources we needed. She reached for my hand, giving it the gentlest squeeze, as if silently confirming that she believed me. I wouldn't claim that life was suddenly perfect. New York is still an expensive city, and caregiving can still be tough. But I'd never felt so hopeful. George's belief that kindness was worth rewarding had flipped my life upside down in the best way possible. It was a reminder that sometimes the risks we take for compassion can shape our future more than any carefully laid plan ever could. As I drifted off to sleep that night, my mother's quiet words played in my mind, echoing the same sentiment, that good things happen to good people. I couldn't say for sure if I deserved all of it, but I knew one thing. Stopping for that dog had changed my life. And every now and then, fate surprises you by making that risk the best decision you ever made.